I have health issues going on. I have to be careful who I let into my personal space.
I'm really pissed off at Liz. I feel like she might have just instigated the end of me and Pedro. What if he just ghosts me forever and that's that? Tonight was supposed to be a girls' night out, but there's just crazy rain outside. The power's down in parts of the area and the streets are flooded.
Yes.
So me and Julia just decided to stay in.
Liz went and told him basically everything I told you guys. She was telling him how I'm not ready and he should be careful. It sounded like she was kind of warning him about me. Okay, what the
You won't believe what happened the moment Sophie decided to hit send on that apology voice note, because what seemed like a small gesture exploded into one of the tensest moments of her entire journey with Pedro, and the way he reacted or didn't react changed everything, leaving a silence so loud. It spoke volumes about their fragile, misfiring connection, and if you're sitting there wondering what she said that made him pull back, you're not alone, because even those close to the situation are still trying to piece together who is really at fault. The voice note wasn't just an apology, it was Sophie's attempt to reset the conversation, to smooth over a misunderstanding she thought Pedro had created, but as soon as he saw it and chose to ignore it, the digital equivalent of slamming a door in someone's face, the emotional ripple went through. Sophie like lightning, and suddenly every little tension, every unspoken accusation, every tiny insecurity she had been carrying after her divorce came screaming back at her. Hey everyone, it's Sabrina from TLC Drama Live, and today we're going to break down the Sophie and Pedro roller coaster in a way that'll make you question everything you thought you knew. So make sure you subscribe and hit that bell, because we're going to be getting into all the drama, the miscommunication, and the moments that are making fans flip sides in this saga. And I want to hear your take in the comments. Who do you think is really at fault here? Because right from the start, the tension wasn't just about a read receipt, it was about patterns, behavior, and perception. Pedro's silence immediately put Sophie on the defensive. She spiraled through questions no one outside their circle would even think to ask. Is he playing a game to see how much I care? Or is he genuinely protecting himself from more emotional fallout? Did I misunderstand his intentions and make it bigger than it really was? And the shadow of Liz's advice hovered over everything, because in Sophie's mind, Liz had supposedly warned Pedro about her, setting the stage for betrayal that may or may not have existed, and suddenly every small gesture between Sophie and Pedro became charged with suspicion. Every glance and message a potential trigger for another fight. Sophie's voice note was supposed to bridge the gap, but it had the opposite effect. As Pedro's unread checkmark glared back at her, she started replaying every conversation in her head, twisting meanings, trying to justify her own insecurities while imagining Pedro doing the same. And then came the talk to Julia and her friends, where Sophie framed Liz as the mastermind who had warned Pedro, conveniently forgetting or maybe genuinely misremembering that Liz's advice had been nothing more than a careful nudge about Sophie's healing and readiness, not a plot to manipulate or sabotage. That's where the story starts to splinter, because the audience sees one version of events, Sophie sees another, and Pedro, silent in his corner, becomes a mirror reflecting all of Sophie's anxieties back at her, magnified and distorted. Every moment after that voice note sent the tension higher. Sophie complained when Pedro seemed too interested, feeling overwhelmed, and complained when he pulled back, feeling abandoned, creating this constant impossible loop of expectation versus reality. And the audience can't help but wonder, did Sophie set this trap for herself? Did Pedro's silence give her what she subconsciously expected, or was he actually holding back because he couldn't navigate the emotional intensity she brought into every conversation? And then there's Liz, lurking on the sidelines in Sophie's retelling of events, cast as the villain without ever stepping on screen in person. Was she really trying to manipulate the situation, or was this entirely Sophie's perception inflated by fear, frustration, and post-divorce vulnerability? The questions pile up, and the tension between all three people feels so thick you can almost cut it with a knife. By the time you're thinking you understand the problem, Sophie's reactions, Pedro's silence, and Liz's indirect influence have already layered multiple open loops that keep your eyes glued to the screen, wondering what's next, and questioning whose reality is actually the right one. And just when it seems like you might have a handle on who's to blame, Sophie's story about Liz warning Pedro raises a new chilling tension. Because if Liz never actually said it, then why is Sophie telling everyone she did? and how much of this drama is built on misperception versus reality. The voice note that was meant to calm the storm has now become the spark that keeps it raging, and every second that Pedro remains silent only amplifies Sophie's spiraling thoughts, making every interaction that follows even more combustible, as if one wrong word could finally ignite the whole powder keg. When you rewind the footage, the story that Sophie tells about Liz suddenly looks very different, because what actually aired shows a conversation that was calm, careful, and almost protective. Not the betrayal Sophie claims, and yet the perception in Sophie's mind has twisted it into a warning. A secret plot that supposedly set Pedro against her, and the question we need to ask is whether Sophie is genuinely misremembering, or whether she is framing the story in a way that makes her the victim. Because the camera doesn't lie, but the human mind sometimes rewrites events in the most convenient way. Liz's words weren't a whisper of sabotage, they were measured advice, gently nudging Sophie to think about her own healing after her divorce, to take time before rushing into emotional entanglements, and if you watch the footage, Liz even frames it as concern for Sophie's well-being. But Sophie interprets it as something sinister, and that gap between what was said and what was heard becomes the real engine of tension, because Pedro's perception of Liz's advice is filtered through Sophie's retelling, meaning he reacts not to the neutral counsel Liz gave, but to the storm Sophie imagines behind it, and suddenly every interaction is clouded with suspicion before anything real has even happened. It's fascinating to see how projection works in real life, and here we have a textbook example. Sophie is recently divorced, emotionally raw and eager for reassurance, yet the very advice meant to protect her gets reframed as a trap, and her mind fills in the gaps with imagined threats. Did Liz intend to warn Pedro against Sophie? The answer from the aired footage is no. Every moment captured shows Liz speaking gently, almost like she's trying to shield Sophie from repeating past mistakes, yet Sophie retells it to friends as a warning, as if she's convinced there's a conspiracy she can't escape, and that's where the drama escalates, because reality TV thrives on perception as much as reality, and Sophie's perception is extremely compelling for viewers even if it isn't fully accurate. When Sophie tells Julia and her friends that Liz warned Pedro, it's not just a casual slip, it's the moment the narrative shifts, where gossip fuels conflict and alliances form, and suddenly Liz, who was never the villain, becomes the figure everyone is scrutinizing, while the true tension lies not in any actual betrayal, but in Sophie's emotional lens. Is she consciously rewriting events, or is this what happens when you're still healing from a divorce, projecting past hurts onto current situations and seeing enemies where none exist? That's the question that sits at the heart of this story, because the footage and Sophie's recounting exist in parallel, both true in their own way, but one reality creates chaos for everyone around her. And then there's the psychological angle. When someone is emotionally fragile, your brain craves a story that explains uncertainty. Sophie's insecurity needs a villain, a person to blame, so she can externalize her fears rather than face the fact that she is still learning how to trust, how to communicate, how to let someone in without second guessing every gesture. Liz unintentionally becomes a symbol for that fear, a stand-in for the anxiety Sophie feels about entering a new relationship, and that's why she amplifies the warning in conversations, because it's easier to point outward than to face inward, and every time she does, Pedro is caught in the middle, unable to reconcile the Sophie he knows with the Sophie who's convinced there's a hidden plot against her. The footage proves there was no backstabbing, yet the perception remains powerful, showing how a single moment of advice can be reframed in someone's mind into something dramatic, and as we watch Sophie's reactions build, it's clear the tension isn't about Liz at all. It's about the gap between perception and reality, the emotional fragility that follows a divorce, and the need for a safe villain to project onto. Because confronting her own insecurities would require acknowledging feelings she isn't ready to face, and that's where the stakes get even higher. Because if the villain exists, only in her mind, every argument, every cold shoulder, and every complaint becomes fuel for conflict that could have been avoided if perception matched reality. And now the real question hangs over the entire story. If Liz never actually plotted against her, Why is Sophie telling everyone she did? And what does that say about the battles she's really fighting inside herself? Sophie's story isn't just about a disagreement or a misunderstood conversation. It's about someone who is still carrying the weight of a recent divorce. Someone whose emotional wounds are raw and whose trust has been shaken. And when you watch her interactions with Pedro, you can't ignore how much that fragility shapes her reactions. Because every word, every glance, and every hesitation is filtered through the lens of someone still learning how to be vulnerable without fear of being hurt again. And that's why even small gestures from Pedro feel enormous, charged with meaning, and sometimes impossible to navigate. Healing doesn't happen overnight. And Sophie's journey reminds us that when someone is emotionally fragile, every interaction becomes a test, not just of the relationship, but of their own capacity to trust. And the moments where she lashes out or overreacts aren't always signs of malice there. Signs of a mind trying to protect itself from further pain. But here's the tricky part. Acknowledging her fragility doesn't excuse her behavior, and that's what makes this story so fascinating. Because it forces us to balance empathy with accountability. Sophie reacts in ways that escalate conflict, spinning minor miscommunications into major emotional storms, and yet underneath that, you can see the patterns of a person struggling to find stability. When Pedro leans in, when he shows interest or affection, Sophie sometimes feels pressure, as if his attention carries weight she isn't ready to handle, and when he pulls back, when he sets boundaries or retreats, she feels abandoned, rejected, or unloved. That push and pull creates a loop that neither of them can easily escape, because the problem isn't just about what Pedro does, it's about how Sophie interprets it through the lens of her own fears and experiences, and that's why it's hard to say where the miscommunication ends and where projection begin. The emotional tension here is layered. Because Pedro isn't doing anything overtly wrong, he's responding to Sophie's needs and behaviors in real time, yet every choice he makes is loaded with meaning she reads into it. And that raises the question, is this really about Pedro at all? Or is it about the unresolved trauma Sophie carries from her past relationship? The insecurity of a woman who's been hurt and is trying to protect herself while simultaneously wanting love and reassurance. The audience can see both sides, the cautious partner and the emotionally vulnerable one, but what's so compelling is that the lines blur, and every interaction becomes a puzzle where the pieces are shaped by past pain, current expectation, and misinterpretation. And this is where the drama intensifies, because even moments that might seem ordinary on the surface, a simple question, a text, a gesture, become loaded with emotional weight. Sophie reacts, Pedro reacts, and the reactions feed back into each other, spiraling into more tension, because neither of them can fully separate action from perception. That's the invisible thread running through every conversation, every argument, and every pause between words, and it's what makes viewers lean in, trying to understand who is at fault, what's real, and what's imagined. It also forces the audience to consider something deeper. If Pedro steps back, is he manipulating Sophie, testing her, or is he simply protecting himself from the intensity of her reaction? And if Sophie complains when he withdraws, is she holding him accountable, or is she projecting her own fears and insecurities onto someone who is trying to navigate a difficult emotional landscape alongside her? Every interaction in this pattern is charged, and the longer the cycle continues, the harder it becomes for either of them to act in a way that feels neutral or safe. Because past trauma doesn't just disappear, it colors every choice and amplifies every misunderstanding, creating tension that both human and unavoidable. And while it's easy to look at Sophie and say she's overreacting, it's also important to remember how much courage it takes to open your heart after a divorce, to try again when trust has been broken, and to confront the fear of being misunderstood in a relationship that is constantly under public scrutiny. Because the stakes aren't just personal, they're amplified by the cameras, the social media commentary, and the constant pressure of being watched, making every mistake feel monumental. Pedro seeing Sophie's apology voice note and choosing to ignore it was a moment loaded with tension so thick you could almost hear the unspoken words between them. Because in that split second, the read receipt became louder than any argument. Louder than any explanation, and louder than any reassurance he could have given, and suddenly, everyone watching is forced to ask the same question. Is this silence an act of maturity, a calculated pause to avoid escalating conflict, or Is it a subtle kind of passive aggression designed to punish Sophie for perceived overreaction? There's a fine line between thoughtful restraint and cold withdrawal, and Pedro teeters on it in a way that keeps viewers squinting at the screen, trying to decode every facial twitch, every glance, and every pause in their conversation. Because the power of silence in a relationship, especially one under the microscope of reality TV, can be equal parts protective and destructive, and Pedro's choice to not respond immediately became an emotional magnifying glass that amplified every insecurity Sophie was already carrying from her divorce and her fragile attempts to trust again. But let's be real. Ignoring a message isn't inherently cruel. It can also be a way to protect yourself from constant emotional volatility. Sophie's reactions, while understandable, are intense and unpredictable, flipping from wanting closeness to feeling overwhelmed almost instantly. And someone on the receiving end of that emotional roller coaster might choose silence as a shield, a moment to recalibrate before diving into the storm. And in Pedro's case, it's hard to tell whether he's strategically pausing, hoping for clarity, or letting tension simmer to see how Sophie reacts. Either way, it's behavior that forces reflection because silence in this context is doing all the talking. And what it says about Pedro and Sophie's dynamic is messy, layered, and absolutely fascinating. We also have to consider the audience perspective. Viewers see Sophie's spiraling thoughts, the anxiety, the overthinking, and the complaints, and many instinctively side with her thinking, why won't he just answer? But that interpretation ignores the exhaustion a partner feels when navigating repeated emotional peaks and valleys, because constant intensity can be draining, even for someone invested in the relationship, and Pedro's silence, while it might sting, could also be his way of protecting his own emotional energy, keeping himself grounded while Sophie wrestles with layers of insecurity she's only beginning to understand. The tension here isn't just about who's right or wrong. It's about how two people with very different emotional rhythms try to coexist under pressure, and how even small choices like whether to respond to a voice note can become symbolic battleground. And the thing is, viewers can't help but speculate, because Pedro's silence leaves a vacuum that Sophie fills with stories, assumptions, and worst-case scenarios. She interprets the unread as disinterest, rejection, or even judgment, and that spiral feeds the drama in ways Pedro may never intend, which raises the unavoidable question. How much of what Sophie experiences is his behavior, and how much is the lens through which she sees it, amplified by her own insecurities and her need for reassurance? It's a tangled web, but that tension is exactly what keeps the camera rolling and the audience glued, because every pause is a signal, every unspoken word a plot point, and every reaction a clue to unraveling the psychological chess game they're unknowingly playing. By the time Sophie talks to Julia, framing the narrative in her own version of events, the stakes get even higher. Because now the silence is no longer just between Sophie and Pedro, it's spreading through their social circle, influencing friendships, alliances, and perceptions, turning a single unread voice note into a catalyst for gossip and potential conflict, and making viewers lean forward, waiting to see how Pedro will respond, whether he will stay silent or finally break it, and what the fallout will be when Sophie's interpretation of his silence reaches other people. The moment Julia steps in to back Sophie, the social dynamic shifts instantly, because what started as a private tension between Sophie and Pedro now spills over into a public battlefield, and suddenly friendship lines are drawn, alliances form, and someone who had been neutral, Liz, finds herself isolated in a way that feels almost tangible through the screen, and viewers can't help but lean in because it's more than just a romantic conflict. It's a social chess game where every comment, every nod, every subtle glance carries weight, and the implications ripple outward faster than anyone could anticipate. Julia siding with Sophie isn't just loyalty, it's validation of Sophie's interpretation of events, and that validation strengthens Sophie's certainty that Liz was somehow plotting against her, even though, according to footage, Liz's advice was gentle and cautious, not a warning or manipulation. And that contrast between what actually happened and what Sophie claims sparks a tension that spreads like wildfire through the friend group, leaving Liz vulnerable and exposed, forced to defend herself in a drama she didn't initiate. Watching this unfold, it's hard not to notice how gossip and perception escalate conflict. Sophie's version of Liz's advice gets repeated, reinterpreted, and amplified, and suddenly it becomes the truth for everyone who isn't looking at the footage directly. Julia, naturally protective of Sophie, lends credence to that story, and the social dynamics pivot completely. Liz, who intended no harm, is now seen as the antagonist, and the audience is left questioning how much of this is reality versus narrative, because perception is powerful, and when a friend backs one side, it validates the drama in a way that makes neutral positions almost impossible to maintain. The way group dynamics work under pressure is fascinating. Loyalty, emotional investment, and the desire to protect someone you care about all collide, and suddenly a simple conversation about healing advice becomes a story of betrayal, with everyone subconsciously taking sides and reinforcing Sophie's narrative. What's even more compelling is that this escalation doesn't require any new actions from Liz. Her isolation and perceived culpability are constructed entirely from Sophie's interpretation, Julia's support, and the way gossip moves through the friend group, which shows just how fragile social trust can be an emotionally charged environment. Liz is caught in a paradox. She has to defend herself without seeming defensive, explain herself without adding fuel to the fire, and navigate friendships that have already started to fracture, all while being mischaracterized by a story that she never actually told. And that tension makes every scene she's in feel electric, because viewers can sense how precarious her position is and how quickly perception can override reality when alliances are formed. At the same time, Sophie's exaggeration or even her unintentional misrepresentation raises questions about intention and self-protection. Because when someone is emotionally vulnerable, framing others as threats can give them a sense of control, a way to explain uncertainty, and a way to validate their own feelings. And Julia's support compounds that effect, giving Sophie confidence in her narrative. While Liz becomes the outsider, the character viewers simultaneously empathize with and root for because she is caught in a drama she never asked for. Every interaction in these group settings amplifies the stakes. A passing comment, a curious glance, a conversation repeated out of context all become tinder for conflict, and the ripple effects are immediate, because in a tight-knit social circle, miscommunication spreads like fire, and each side's perception becomes reality to those experiencing it. And that's what keeps viewers watching, because it isn't just a love story, it's a story of social loyalty, miscommunication, and perceived betrayal, all magnified by the intensity of emotions and the pressure of public scrutiny. And the most intriguing question lingers in the air. Did Sophie exaggerate Liz's words to feel safer in the chaos, or was she simply interpreting advice through the lens of her own fragility, creating a triangle of tension that might never have existed if one sentence had been understood as it was actually said? And now the audience is left wondering, what if? The entire drama is built on a single misinterpreted comment, and how will Liz navigate a friend group that thinks she's the villain? If you've been watching closely, a pattern emerges that nobody seems to be talking about, and once you see it, it's impossible to ignore. Sophie's reactions swing like a pendulum, and every move Pedro makes, whether leaning in or pulling back, gets interpreted through an emotional magnifying glass. That makes ordinary moments feel catastrophic, and this is where the drama explodes in ways that keep viewers glued to the screen. Because the tension isn't just in what's happening, it's in how Sophie experiences it. When Pedro shows interest, even the smallest gesture, Sophie sometimes recoils, complains, or interprets it as pressure, as if attention itself is a burden, and the audience is left asking themselves, is this about him at all, or is this about the patterns of insecurity that have been stitched into Sophie's responses after everything she's been through? Then, almost immediately, if Pedro withdraws, even momentarily, Sophie flips again, interpreting silence as rejection, abandonment, or disinterest, and that back and forth becomes the engine of conflict, a loop that escalates tension, keeps arguments simmering, and makes each scene unpredictable, because you never know which Sophie will show up next. It's fascinating, in my opinion, how the same behavior can trigger completely opposite reactions, depending on timing, context, or Sophie's emotional state, and that unpredictability feeds the narrative machine. The audience is drawn to it, because it's messy, human, and entirely relatable to anyone who's been in a relationship where intentions and feelings don't always line up. Allegedly, this pattern isn't about manipulation in the traditional sense, but it's behavior that carries consequences for Pedro. Because when someone reacts inconsistently to affection and withdrawal, it places the partner in an impossible position, they can't win, and every choice they make becomes a test rather than a moment of connection. And Pedro's responses, calm, measured, or sometimes silent, are the only anchors in this storm, which makes every pause, every unread message, every non-committal gesture feel like high-stakes drama. And here's the kicker. This inconsistency forces you to question whether Sophie is truly seeking reassurance, or whether deep down she's testing boundaries, exerting control, or trying to feel safe in a way that comes at the cost of clarity. Because wanting love and wanting control can look dangerously similar, and if the partner isn't perfectly attuned, tension explodes. When Pedro steps back, it's framed as coldness. When he leans in, it's framed as pressure. And in both cases, viewers are left analyzing body language, text tones, and context to understand what's happening. That ambiguity fuels conversation, speculation, and emotional investment. Because we're drawn to complexity, and reality TV thrives on the uncertainty between intention and perception. The faster pacing here mirrors the chaos in Sophie's head, emotions racing, judgments fluctuating, and every interaction a potential trigger, while Pedro's calm, deliberate behavior provides a counterpoint that highlights the imbalance, the misalignment, and the subtle tension that exists when two people are operating on entirely different emotional wavelengths. And what makes it so compelling is that the pattern is subtle but relentless. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It seeps into every exchange, every message, and every small gesture, creating a rhythm of conflict that is invisible to most casual viewers but impossible to ignore for those paying attention. And the ultimate question emerges. Is Pedro reacting to mixed signals, trying to navigate an impossible emotional landscape while maintaining some semblance of stability? Or is Sophie creating a feedback loop that feeds tension for reasons she may not even consciously recognize? Because when affection and withdrawal are treated as threats, the dynamic spirals, trust falters, and every interaction carries more weight than it should. That tension, that push and pull, is exactly what keeps viewers invested. Because each scene raises the stakes, layers complexity, and makes you lean closer trying to figure out who's driving the narrative, the person acting, the person reacting, or the perception in between. When you line up the footage against the stories being told later, the contrast is striking, because what we actually saw Sophie and Pedro do on camera often doesn't match the version that circulates among friends and social media, and that gap between receipts and feelings is where the real drama lives, because viewers are constantly trying to reconcile the two, asking themselves, am I watching reality or am I watching perception rewritten in real time? Take the voice note, for example. Pedro's silence is on record, Sophie's reaction is on record, but then the narrative spreads, amplified by friends, commentary, and social media, transforming a simple moment into a sprawling story of betrayal, overreaction, and hidden agendas, and suddenly the stakes feel higher than they actually were in the room. That tension, that dissonance between evidence and emotional interpretation fuels the episode, keeps viewers debating, and makes us question our own instinct, because we naturally want to defend the person we empathize with, and Sophie's vulnerability makes her an easy candidate. But here's where it gets tricky. Just because viewers side with Sophie doesn't mean the receipts aren't important, and analyzing them closely reveals layers of human behavior that are often overlooked. Every glance, every word, every pause Pedro gives has to be interpreted in context. Sometimes he's tired, sometimes he's cautious, sometimes he's reacting to Sophie's intensity, and sometimes he's just waiting for the right moment, but in the retelling, these subtleties get flattened. And suddenly, small actions carry outsized meaning, which escalates tension even further. When Sophie shares her version with Julia and others, the footage doesn't change, but the perception does, and suddenly the spiral begins. Each side interprets the same actions differently, projecting fears, insecurities, and assumptions onto the other. And that's when you realize that in these stories, perception often becomes more powerful than fact. And that's why the receipts versus feelings debate is so compelling. It forces the audience to examine their own biases, because are you defending Sophie because she's vulnerable, because she's freshly divorced, or because you actually see Pedro acting in a way that justifies concern? Allegedly, it isn't about innocence or guilt in a traditional sense, it's about emotional interpretation, storytelling, and the human tendency to favor the narrative we connect with, which is exactly what makes this cycle so sticky for viewers, because it engages empathy, judgment, and curiosity all at once. Every pause, every text, every word becomes a point of analysis, and the longer it continues, the more invested the audience becomes in dissecting who's right, who's wrong, and who's misreading the other. What's even more fascinating is how the sequence of events gets reframed depending on who's recounting it. A comment that was neutral on camera can be replayed as accusatory in conversation. A gesture meant to reassure can be reinterpreted as manipulative, and Sophie's version spreads faster than any correction, which means Liz, who intended nothing but guidance, now exists in the narrative as the potential villain, a role she never sought, but one that's amplified by Sophie's emotional lens and the reactions of those around her. That tension is exactly what drives viewers to stick with the story. They want clarity, they want resolution, but every layer you peel back reveals more ambiguity, more complexity, and more drama waiting to explode. And that leads to the ultimate question lingering in every scene. If both Sophie and Pedro are reacting, interpreting, and misinterpreting simultaneously, then who actually started the spiral? And does it even matter if the story is now bigger than either of them? Because once perception overtakes reality, every small action feeds into a feedback loop, and the audience is left watching a chain reaction that started with a single choice, a single misunderstanding, and a single unspoken tension that has grown into a full-blown emotional battlefield. And now, we're all left waiting to see who will break the cycle, or if the cycle will keep spinning until it consumes the relationship entirely. At this point, it's worth stepping back and asking the question everyone whispers but few admit out loud: is there really a love triangle here? Or is it just an illusion built from insecurity, gossip, and misinterpretation? The way Sophie tells the story makes it feel like Liz is scheming, Pedro is torn, and alliances are forming like a slow-burning reality TV plot. But when you reconstruct what actually aired, what you see is less intrigue and more human tension amplified by perception. Because reality TV thrives on editing that emphasizes drama without creating it, and even a few well-placed cuts, pauses, or repeated reactions can make a simple moment feel like betrayal. Sophie's insecurities, her need for reassurance, and the stories she shares with Julia magnify those small moments into something far bigger than the footage itself, and that's where the triangle begins to feel like more of a narrative construct than a real situation. What makes it so fascinating and a little heartbreaking is that the real tension might not be about two people competing for Pedro's attention, but about Sophie trying to process her own emotional fragility while navigating new relationships, friendships, and a social circle that suddenly feels like a minefield. Liz's advice, which was intended to be thoughtful and cautious, gets reframed in Sophie's mind as something conspiratorial, and the gossip that spreads through the group only reinforces that perception, creating the illusion of a triangle without anyone actually plotting or scheming. Pedro, meanwhile, is caught in the middle, reacting in real time to Sophie's mixed signals, the social pressure, and his own instincts, but because the cameras are rolling and moments are replayed, every pause, every unread message, and every subtle gesture becomes evidence in a narrative he may not even realize he's part of. And that's where the stakes start to rise. Because if these misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and projected insecurities continue unchecked, the relationship itself is at risk. A cycle of emotional push and pull, gossip, and perceived betrayal doesn't just make good television, it erodes trust, destabilizes connections, and makes it harder for both parties to see each other clearly, even off camera. The longer Sophie frames Liz as a villain, the more Pedro is forced to navigate conflicting loyalties, and the more the audience watches, the more invested we become in guessing whether the tension will resolve or escalate into something irreparable. Reality TV editing may nudge the audience to expect confrontations, hidden motives, or shocking reveals, but the heart of this story is entirely human: miscommunication, emotional projection, and the struggle to rebuild trust after vulnerability has been broken. Sophie's need to feel safe, her reactions to perceived slights, and the way friends like Julia amplify or validate her perspective all contribute to a drama that feels huge, but at its core, it may be less about betrayal and more about the natural friction that happens when fragile emotions collide with high expectations and public scrutiny. And as viewers, we're left with the tension that fuels the next set of scenes. What happens when trust, which is already delicate, cracks in a public way, in front of friends, in front of cameras, and in front of the world watching online? If Pedro misreads signals, if Sophie misinterprets intentions, or if gossip spreads faster than conversation, the consequences aren't just dramatic, they're potentially relationship breaking. Because in situations like this, perception becomes reality, and one misstep can shift everything. The triangle may not be real, but the risk of emotional collapse is, and that uncertainty is what keeps us leaning forward, trying to anticipate what comes next, and questioning how a series of small misunderstandings can grow into something that feels irreversible. Finally, we reach a moment where the chaos slows, just enough to ask a question that's rarely voiced in the middle of the drama: what would real growth look like here, for both Sophie and Pedro? Because the story so far has been a cycle of mixed signals, miscommunication, and projection, and if either of them wants to break that cycle, it starts with accountability, really looking at what each of them contributed to the tension rather than just assigning blame. For Sophie, that means admitting to herself that not every reaction is about Pedro's actions, that some of it stems from lingering insecurities after her divorce, and acknowledging the moments when her need for reassurance blurred the line between seeking connection and trying to control the situation. For Pedro, it might mean recognizing that silence, however intended, can be interpreted in ways that escalate fear and anxiety, and that some form of communication, however small, could have prevented spiraling interpretation. An apology in this scenario isn't a quick "I'm sorry" delivered for the cameras, it has to go deeper. For Sophie, apologizing would involve acknowledging the emotional weight she placed on Pedro, the assumptions she made about Liz, and the ways in which she projected fear and insecurity onto people who were trying to support her. For Pedro, an apology would require admitting that his silence, while perhaps intended as protection, created confusion and hurt feelings, and that he could have done more to close the gap between intention and perception. Both apologies would need to recognize how behavior, actions, reactions, and omissions impacts trust, especially when emotions are already heightened, and both would need to be delivered with honesty rather than defensiveness, because that is the only way to turn the spiral of miscommunication into a path toward understanding. This is also where some of the earlier open loops pay off. The projections, the unread voice notes, the complaints when he leans in and when he withdraws, all of it ties back to a simple truth: neither of them is entirely wrong, but neither is fully aware of the ways their behavior feeds the other's insecurities. Recognizing that requires stepping outside of emotion for a moment, seeing patterns for what they are, and choosing to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. If Sophie can acknowledge that Liz was not the villain, that Pedro's intentions were not manipulative, and that she sometimes misread signals because of her own fragility, she begins to untangle the web she has been weaving in her own mind. If Pedro can recognize that silence is interpreted and that he has a role in calming uncertainty, he can begin to break the cycle of tension that has defined so many interactions between them. The path forward isn't easy, and it certainly isn't glamorous. Growth isn't about one dramatic scene or a viral confession. It's about repeated choices, careful communication, and the courage to confront discomfort instead of avoiding it. It requires both parties to step into vulnerability while also respecting boundaries, and to trust that admitting mistakes doesn't make them weak, it makes the relationship stronger, if both are willing to meet in the middle. But the lingering question, the tension that will carry viewers to the final act, is whether either of them is ready to make that choice. Can Sophie set aside her fears long enough to give Pedro the benefit of the doubt? And can Pedro communicate in a way that reassures without feeling trapped? Accountability is the bridge between chaos and trust, but building that bridge requires maturity, self-awareness, and courage. And in the world of Sophie, Pedro, and Liz, those qualities have yet to be fully tested, which leaves viewers asking the one question that keeps the suspense alive: are either of them truly ready to choose maturity, or will the cycle continue spinning tension into the next chapter of this drama? It all comes back to that single voice note. The one Sophie sent, the one Pedro saw and didn't respond to. In the beginning, it felt like a spark that ignited a wildfire of misunderstanding, gossip, and emotional chaos, but looking at it now, after tracing every reaction, every projection, and every misstep, it becomes clear that the voice note isn't the villain, it's the symbol of the entire story. The perfect lens for miscommunication and the way humans interpret each other under stress. That simple unread message created tension not because it was malicious or ignored with intent, but because of how perception, emotion, and prior trauma collided, and in many ways it reflects the larger truth about relationships under pressure. Small things take on outsized meaning when trust is fragile, when past wounds linger, and when social context amplifies every gesture. Pedro's silence, Sophie's projection, Liz's unintended advice, and Julia's support, all of it spiraled from that one moment, showing us how fragile communication can be when filtered through emotional fragility and high stakes. And the reality of it is balanced and complicated. Neither Sophie nor Pedro is purely right or purely wrong. Sophie's reactions were amplified by insecurity, but her feelings were real. Pedro's restraint may have been mature, but it created a gap that Sophie filled with assumption. Liz never plotted against anyone, but the perception of her role changed the social dynamic completely. The verdict is clear in its nuance. This wasn't a triangle born of betrayal, it was a tangle of human emotions, misinterpretations, and the very human need to protect oneself, amplified by a camera and a friend group that spreads narrative like wildfire. For viewers, this is the emotional release point. The moment to let go of the tension and realize the drama isn't about villains or heroes, it's about people navigating relationships with imperfect tools and imperfect awareness. You feel the relief that comes with seeing patterns clearly, the satisfaction of understanding where perception overtook reality, and yet the curiosity remains, because in true reality TV fashion, the lessons learned here aren't the end, they're a setup for what comes next. And that's exactly the clever thing about this franchise. The way one couple's miscommunication can mirror others, and while we won't name names yet, the audience can already sense that the next storyline will feature the same mix of emotional fragility, loyalty conflicts, and silent tension that keeps fans obsessed. This final reflection also brings us full circle, reinforcing the idea that the story is more about human behavior than any single action. The unread voice note, the whispered gossip, the moments of doubt, all of them are mirrors for how relationships fail or survive under pressure, and that's why dissecting these dynamics is so compelling. You don't just watch a show, you watch human psychology in motion. A cycle that repeats, shifts, and surprises with every new episode, every new couple, and every new choice made in the heat of emotion. So as we close this chapter, the takeaway is clear. Miscommunication is the thread that runs through it all. Projection fuels tension, and empathy is the lens we need to understand what really happened. But if you think this drama is over, think again. Because the next couple we're going to explore brings an entirely new set of stakes, secrets, and silent conflicts that are guaranteed to leave viewers questioning who's in control and who's being misunderstood. And if you want to see exactly how another volatile dynamic unfolds, where every gesture, every word, and every silent pause could change everything, you won't want to miss the next breakdown. It's going to make you see reality TV relationships in a completely new way.